600,000 soldiers marched into Russia, but only 100,000 came back. The greatest army in Europe, frozen, starving, gone. How could one man, the genius who conquered half the continent, lose it all to a silent enemy called winter? Snowflakes drifted through the frozen air as thousands of men stumbled along the road, their faces pale, eyes empty, bodies shaking from hunger and cold. Horses collapsed where they stood, too weak to move. Muskets were useless, frozen solid. Fingers and toes turned black from frostbite. Out of the 600,000 soldiers who had marched proudly into Russia, only a broken fraction remained. The mighty French army, once the terror of Europe, was now a shivering, starving mass, slowly being swallowed by the Russian winter. And at the center of it all rode one man, Napoleon Bonaparte. The same man who had conquered Europe, who kings feared and emperors envied, was now watching his empire crumble in the snow. But this disaster did not begin in the cold. It began months earlier, when Napoleon stood at the very peak of his power. He had beaten every major army in Europe. Austria, Prussia, Spain, each had fallen before his lightning-fast attacks. He moved his troops like a master chess player, striking before enemies could react. People compared him to a storm, a genius, even a force of nature. Yet there was one nation he could not break: Britain. The island nation kept trading with the world, building wealth and funding armies against him. Napoleon tried to strangle Britain's economy with something called the Continental System, a giant trade blockade, like cutting off oxygen to a fire. If no one in Europe traded with Britain, its power would burn out. But Tsar Alexander I of Russia refused to follow the plan. His country needed trade to survive. He would not let Napoleon control him. And that was when Napoleon made his fateful choice. If Russia would not obey, he would force them to. He believed one quick, powerful campaign would bring the Tsar to his knees. So in the summer of 1812, Napoleon gathered the largest army Europe had ever seen. 600,000 men from France and its allies. Imagine 10 massive football stadiums, every seat filled with soldiers, cannons, and horses. He called it the Grand Army, and it looked unstoppable. They marched into Russia with drums beating, flags flying, spirits high. But Russia was unlike any land Napoleon had conquered before. The country was endless. Roads were little more than dirt paths. Towns were scattered far apart. And then came the Russian strategy, a simple but cruel trick. As Napoleon's army advanced, Russian troops retreated deeper into their own land, burning everything behind them. Fields, villages, food stores, gone. It was called the scorched earth tactic, and it was like playing a game where the opponents kept wiping the board clean before you could take a move. The deeper Napoleon marched, the worse things became. The summer heat was brutal. Soldiers fainted from hunger and thirst. Horses collapsed by the thousands, leaving cannons stuck in the mud. Still, Napoleon pushed on, convinced the Russians would eventually fight a big battle and surrender. Finally, in September, near Moscow, he got what he wanted. The Battle of Borodino was fought with savage fury. Muskets roared, cannons thundered, men charged into clouds of smoke and fire. By the end of the day, around 70,000 soldiers lay dead or wounded. Napoleon's army claimed victory, but the Russians slipped away once again, leaving the road to Moscow open. Napoleon entered Moscow expecting peace talks. Surely now the Tsar would give up. But the city was almost empty.
its people gone. Then, fires broke out across Moscow. Some blamed Russian patriots who refused to let Napoleon use the city as a prize. Soon, flames devoured wooden houses and buildings. Smoke choked the streets. Napoleon waited in the ruins for weeks. No surrender came. No food either. Winter winds crept closer each day. And then came the moment that would haunt him forever. The first snow fell.
It was gentle at first, then merciless. Temperatures plunged below minus 20 degrees Celsius. Soldiers wrapped themselves in rags, burned furniture for warmth, tried to chew on leather straps when food ran out. Frostbite stole fingers, noses, and ears. Horses froze where they stood. Guns cracked in the cold. The once proud Grand Army was now a trail of starving, dying men, staggering through ice and snow. And behind them came the Russian forces, like wolves, circling a wounded prey. They cut off stragglers, attacked the weak, and watched as winter did the rest. Of the 600,000 men who had marched into Russia, only about 100,000 crawled back out. The rest were dead, captured, or lost forever in the white silence of the Russian winter. Napoleon returned to Paris, trying to raise a new army, but his spell was broken. The nations of Europe smelled blood. Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia joined forces. 2 years later, they crushed Napoleon and sent him into exile. And it all began with one march into Russia, one decision that would shatter an empire. But here is the question. Why did Napoleon stay so long in Moscow, waiting while his army starved, when he could have turned back before winter came? That is where the story takes an even darker turn. Stay with me, because in the next few minutes, you'll see how ambition, weather, and one terrible decision turned Napoleon's empire into ashes, and why this disaster still echoes through history today.